Hi, welcome to my channel, Still Via Sleep. Please subscribe.
Today we talk about Queen Isolde and her quiet kingdom. The sun rose slowly over the kingdom of Valorith, spilling pale light across its slate rooftops and quiet streets. The towers of the castle reflected this light faintly, casting long, soft shadows across the courtyard. The kingdom itself seemed suspended in the gentle glow, as if it were waiting for the day to begin, but in its own time, not hurried by the sun. Queen Isolde sat in her private chamber, a small, austere room at the highest tower of the castle. The walls were adorned with tapestries of muted colors, showing the queens and rulers who had lived before her. She ran her fingers lightly over one of them, feeling the worn threads under her fingertips. Each thread, each stitch seemed to tell a story of patience, of quiet days measured in routine rather than drama. Her crown rested on a velvet cushion on the desk nearby. Unlike the kings of other lands, Isolde's crown was simple, a thin band of silver, unadorned except for a single pale gemstone that caught the light faintly. She did not immediately wear it. Instead, she observed the room, listening to the faint sounds of the castle waking slowly. A door creaked far down the hall. Somewhere a servant swept the stone floor, brushing the dust lazily into neat piles. Even the wind that drifted through the open window seemed careful not to disturb anything. Outside, in the courtyard, the gardens began their daily stirrings. Roses, lavender, and herbs slowly turned toward the sunlight. A gardener adjusted the watering cans and swept the paths in quiet, measured steps. Each leaf, each petal seemed to acknowledge the arrival of the day with deliberate patience. Birds moved lazily across the sky, singing only when they chose, their voices soft and unhurried. Within the castle, servants went about their duties with a calm, almost ceremonial rhythm. A maid arranged cushions in the sitting chamber. Another laid out Queen Isolde's simple breakfast of bread, cheese, and water, taking care that nothing was out of place. The clink of utensils and the gentle scrape of dishes echoed faintly in the high-ceilinged corridors. Queen Isolde rose slowly from her chair and walked to the window. She looked down at the streets of Valorith. Few people were awake at this hour. A baker kneaded dough, shaping it carefully, while a blacksmith tapped lightly at a piece of metal, each blow spaced apart to allow the echo to fade fully before the next. Even the children who wandered the streets did so without hurry, tracing their fingers along walls, noticing cracks and lines in the stone, their eyes wide with quiet curiosity, but their steps unhurried. The day moved on, almost imperceptibly. Sunlight climbed higher, shadows shifted slowly, and Queen Isolde observed it all, sometimes noting the smallest detail, a flutter of a bird's wing, a gentle sway of a branch in the courtyard garden, the dust motes dancing in a beam of light. Her mind wandered over these small movements, understanding them, yet never needing to intervene. Her reign, like the day, was patient, careful, and deliberate. By noon, the kingdom of Valorith was fully awake, yet still slow. Merchants opened their shutters, but their calls were soft and deliberate. The streets were filled with movement, but not excitement. Everything proceeded according to habit, not urgency. Queen Isolde walked back to her chamber, her silver crown still on the cushion. She would wear it later, perhaps, in a ceremony without audience, for herself more than anyone else. Evening approached slowly. The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed reluctant to move. The palace lights glowed softly, illuminating the tapestries, the hallways, the quiet faces of the servants. In the distance, the mountains loomed, silent witnesses to the measured passage of time in the kingdom of Valorith. And so the day ended as it had begun, without drama, without rush, perfectly unremarkable, yet profoundly serene. Queen Isolde's reign, like the kingdom itself, was a rhythm of patience, quiet observation, and careful endurance. Morning in Valorith did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded gradually, like a curtain being pulled back one careful inch at a time. The light first touched the highest towers of the castle, then slowly crept downward, reaching the stone walls, the quiet courtyards, and finally the streets below. Nothing reacted quickly to this change. The kingdom accepted mourning the way it accepted everything else, with patience. Queen Isolde sat in her private chamber, a small, austere room at the highest tower of the castle. The walls were adorned with tapestries of muted colors showing the queens and rulers who had lived before her. She ran her fingers lightly over one of them, feeling the worn threads under her fingertips. Each thread, each stitch seemed to tell a story of patience, of quiet days measured in routine rather than drama. Her crown rested on a velvet cushion on the desk nearby. Unlike the kings of other lands, Isolde's crown was simple, a thin band of silver, unadorned except for a single pale gemstone that caught the light faintly. She did not immediately wear it. Instead, she observed the room, listening to the faint sounds of the castle waking slowly. A door creaked far down the hall. Somewhere a servant swept the stone floor, brushing the dust lazily into neat piles. Even the wind that drifted through the open window seemed careful not to disturb anything. Outside, in the courtyard, the gardens began their daily stirrings. Roses, lavender, and herbs slowly turned toward the sunlight. A gardener adjusted the watering cans and swept the paths in quiet, measured steps. Each leaf, each petal seemed to acknowledge the arrival of the day with deliberate patience. Birds moved lazily across the sky, singing only when they chose, their voices soft and unhurried. Within the castle, servants went about their duties with a calm, almost ceremonial rhythm. A maid arranged cushions in the sitting chamber. Another laid out Queen Isolde's simple breakfast of bread, cheese, and water, taking care that nothing was out of place. The clink of utensils and the gentle scrape of dishes echoed faintly in the high-ceilinged corridors. Queen Isolde rose slowly from her chair and walked to the window. She looked down at the streets of Valorith. Few people were awake at this hour. A baker kneaded dough, shaping it carefully, while a blacksmith tapped lightly at a piece of metal, each blow spaced apart to allow the echo to fade fully before the next. Even the children who wandered the streets did so without hurry, tracing their fingers along walls, noticing cracks and lines in the stone, their eyes wide with quiet curiosity, but their steps unhurried. The day moved on, almost imperceptibly. Sunlight climbed higher, shadows shifted slowly, and Queen Isolde observed it all, sometimes noting the smallest detail, a flutter of a bird's wing, a gentle sway of a branch in the courtyard garden, the dust motes dancing in a beam of light. Her mind wandered over these small movements, understanding them, yet never needing to intervene. Her reign, like the day, was patient, careful, and deliberate. By noon, the kingdom of Valorith was fully awake, yet still slow. Merchants opened their shutters, but their calls were soft and deliberate. The streets were filled with movement, but not excitement. Everything proceeded according to habit, not urgency. Queen Isolde walked back to her chamber, her silver crown still on the cushion. She would wear it later, perhaps, in a ceremony without audience, for herself more than anyone else. Evening approached slowly. The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed reluctant to move. The palace lights glowed softly, illuminating the tapestries, the hallways, the quiet faces of the servants. In the distance, the mountains loomed, silent witnesses to the measured passage of time in the kingdom of Valorith. And so the day ended as it had begun, without drama, without rush, perfectly unremarkable, yet profoundly serene. Queen Isolde's reign, like the kingdom itself, was a rhythm of patience, quiet observation, and careful endurance. Morning in Valorith did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded gradually, like a curtain being pulled back one careful inch at a time. The light first touched the highest towers of the castle, then slowly crept downward, reaching the stone walls, the quiet courtyards, and finally the streets below. Nothing reacted quickly to this change. The kingdom accepted mourning the way it accepted everything else, with patience. Queen Isolde sat in her private chamber, a small, austere room at the highest tower of the castle. The afternoon stretched lazily across the kingdom. The sun climbed gradually, golden rays filtering through the high castle windows, creating patterns on the stone floor. Queen Isolde sat near the window in her private study, a book open before her. The pages were filled with histories and chronicles of rulers past, yet she read slowly, letting her eyes drift over each line as though savoring the words. Outside, the courtyard garden continued its quiet work. The gardeners trimmed hedges with deliberate motions, measured the spacing between plants, and occasionally paused to inspect a blossom or a stray weed. Birds flitted above, swooping low only when the gardener's movement disturbed the air slightly. In the distance, the blacksmith tapped rhythmically at a metal piece, each blow deliberate and spaced, so that the sound lingered briefly in the warm air before fading. The children were still wandering the streets. Some examined the moss on the walls, counting patterns with meticulous care, while others watched the movement of the fountain water, observing the slow rise and fall of each droplet. Their faces held quiet curiosity, unhurried and patient, the same as the rhythm of the kingdom itself. Inside the castle, the kitchen staff prepared lunch. The aroma of bread and roasted vegetables spread faintly through the halls. A cook sliced herbs with careful, steady motions, arranging them in small bundles for later use. A servant carried a pot of warm water across the corridor, stepping carefully to avoid spilling, ensuring the quietude of the space remained undisturbed. Queen Isolde walked through the castle halls after lunch, her silver crown set aside. She moved deliberately, observing the architecture and the decorations she had memorized over years of wandering these corridors. The portraits of her ancestors lined the walls, their muted expressions seemingly observing her as she passed. She paused occasionally to touch a frame, feeling the cool wood beneath her fingertips, noting the smoothness of the paint and the subtle changes in color over decades. By late afternoon, the sun began to tilt lower in the sky. The gardens were bathed in a soft amber light. Shadows lengthened gradually, stretching across the gravel paths and stone steps. Queen Isolde stepped onto the balcony, overlooking the town. The streets below were quiet, a few people moving slowly, engaged in tasks that had been repeated countless times before. A baker adjusted a tray of bread, a merchant swept the step in front of his shop, a child lingered near the fountain, tracing its edges with careful attention. Evening approached with deliberate patience. The sky shifted slowly from gold to rose and finally to a pale lavender. Queen Isolde returned to her chamber, preparing herself for a quiet dinner and the slow transition into night. In Valorith, life continued at its own unhurried pace, measured in the soft sounds of daily tasks, the gentle movements of people and animals, and the persistent, patient passing of time. The sun began its slow descent behind the distant hills, casting long, stretching shadows across the kingdom of Valorith. The light softened, turning from gold to amber and finally to a pale, muted rose. The stone walls of the castle seemed to drink in the light, reflecting it faintly onto the cobblestone courtyard below. Everything in the kingdom moved with deliberate calm. The wind drifted lazily through the streets, birds returned to their nests, and even the faint trickle of the fountain seemed quieter, as if aware of the approaching night. Queen Isolde sat in her chamber, her hands folded lightly in her lap. The silver crown rested on a velvet cushion beside her, catching the last rays of sunlight and reflecting a pale, soft glow. She did not wear it. For her, the crown was less a symbol to be displayed than a reminder of the gentle responsibility she carried, the quiet patience required to govern a kingdom that moved slowly, deliberately, and predictably. The evening meal was prepared with the same care and patience that marked every other task in Valorith. A small fire glowed in the hearth, casting gentle, flickering light across the walls. The cook arranged plates with meticulous precision: slices of bread, roasted vegetables, a few pieces of mild cheese, and a jug of water. Each item was placed exactly where it belonged, and each movement of the cook's hands was slow and purposeful. A servant carried the tray to the queen's chamber, stepping carefully to avoid disturbing the quiet rhythm of the hallways. Outside, in the courtyard, the gardeners were finishing their work for the day. One woman pruned the last of the rose bushes, while another watered the herbs, droplets falling softly onto the soil, creating a delicate, rhythmic pattern. The children who wandered the streets during the day had returned home, but a few lingered near the fountain, watching the water shimmer in the fading light. They spoke in whispers, their movements careful, measured, as if the world itself had slowed in respect for the coming night. Queen Isolde rose slowly and moved toward the balcony. From there she could see the entire town below, bathed in the soft glow of lanterns beginning to light the streets. The movement of people was minimal: a baker closing his shop, a merchant sweeping the step in front of his shop. A child lingered near the fountain, tracing its edges with careful attention. The queen reflected quietly on the day as she watched. She noticed how the light touched the homes of the houses, how the leaves of the trees swayed just slightly in the gentle evening breeze. Even the distant mountains seemed patient, unmoving, steadfast against the gradual passage of time. There was no urgency in Valorith, no sudden events, no need for haste. It was a kingdom governed by patience, observation, and quiet endurance. After a while, the queen returned to her chamber. The meal awaited her, arranged perfectly on the table. She ate slowly, deliberately, tasting each bite, appreciating the textures and the warmth of the food. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, providing a steady, gentle background to her thoughts. Outside the windows, the lanterns flickered, the faint sounds of the evening drifted in, and the wind whispered through the stone corridors. By the time the last light of the sun faded, the castle had assumed a deep, calm stillness. Servants moved quietly to their quarters, ensuring everything was in its proper place. The gardens were shadowed, the fountain reflected the first stars, and the streets of Valorith became almost completely silent. Even the animals seemed to understand the rhythm. Cats curled up on doorsteps, dogs lay on mats, and birds slept in their nests, all part of the deliberate, measured pace of the kingdom. Queen Isolde placed the silver crown back on its cushion, leaning slightly to adjust its position until it rested perfectly flat. She walked to the window one last time, gazing over the quiet streets. There was no drama, no excitement, no news to alter the course of the kingdom, and yet there was a profound serenity in this unchanging pattern, a quiet fulfillment in the stillness of daily life. Finally, she withdrew to her bed, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The night settled over Valorith like a soft, heavy blanket, carrying the scent of herbs from the gardens and the distant memory of the sun's warmth. Time moved slowly, measured in the soft breathing of the queen, the gentle flickering of the firelight, and the unwavering rhythm of the kingdom that rested under the stars. And so the evening ended as it began, slow, deliberate, and profoundly unremarkable, the kind of calm that marked the essence of Queen Isolde's reign. Night arrived in Valorith without suddenness. There was no dramatic twilight, no sudden rush of darkness. Instead, the light faded gradually, melting from pale rose to soft lavender, and then to the muted gray of early evening, before the deep blue of night settled across the kingdom. The stars appeared one by one, careful and unhurried, twinkling faintly above the quiet rooftops. Inside the castle, Queen Isolde's chambers were bathed in the gentle glow of a few strategically placed lanterns. Their light reflected faintly off the polished stone floor, creating small pools of warmth amidst the deep shadows. She moved slowly across the room, her footsteps silent on the soft carpet. The silver crown rested nearby, untouched, its metal catching the flicker of the lantern flames in subdued glimmers. The castle itself was still, but not completely silent. Faint sounds drifted from distant corridors, the soft creak of a door swinging shut, the muted shuffle of a servant returning to quarters, and the occasional deliberate drip of water from the fountain outside. These were small, ordinary sounds, yet in the stillness of the night they seemed amplified, each one marking time as it passed. The queen walked to the balcony, wrapped in a shawl of pale silk. From this vantage, the kingdom appeared even more quiet. The streets below were deserted, the shops shuttered, and the occasional lantern flickered in the windows of homes where families had long since retired for the night. In the gardens, shadows lengthened under the pale light of the moon. A cat moved slowly among the hedges, stopping occasionally to sniff at a flower, then continuing its silent patrol. Even the wind moved cautiously, drifting through the leaves and brushing the stones of the courtyard with soft, measured strokes. It carried the scent of lavender and damp earth from the gardens, blending with the faint aroma of bread cooling in the baker's shop. The distant mountains were silhouetted against the starry sky, steady and unchanging, silent observers of the kingdom's nocturnal rhythms. Queen Isolde returned to her chamber, settling into her chair by the fire. The embers glowed faintly, casting soft, flickering shadows across the walls. She placed a small cup of water on the table and gazed into its still surface, observing the reflections of the lanterns and the slow movement of shadows. Her mind wandered quietly, noting the minutiae of the day, the way the roses bent slightly toward the sun, the manner in which the children traced patterns in the stones, the precise rhythm of the gardener's movements. Everything was small, deliberate, and unhurried, yet she observed it all with patient attention. Meanwhile, in the corridors of the castle, the night staff moved in slow, deliberate steps. They extinguished unnecessary lights, checked doors, and ensured that each room was in proper order. Their movements were careful, silent, and precise. Not a single task was rushed, nor did any sound disturb the overarching calm of the night. Even the servants' breaths seemed measured, synchronized with the natural rhythm of the castle. Outside, the kingdom rested. The fountain dripped in its quiet, steady cadence, and the occasional night bird called softly, its song almost swallowed by the immense stillness of the streets. The air was cool, carrying faint scents of herbs, flowers, and the lingering warmth of the day. Every element, from the smallest leaf to the tallest tower, moved at its own unhurried pace, preserving the tranquility of Valorith. Finally, Queen Isolde rose and prepared for bed. She adjusted the folds of her gown, set the crown carefully on its cushion, and extinguished the lanterns, leaving only the soft glow of embers in the hearth. She lay down slowly, pulling the sheets around her with deliberate care. The night had fully settled over the kingdom, calm, patient, and unchanging. As she closed her eyes, the rhythm of Valorith continued unabated. The distant mountains remained unmoved, the wind whispered softly through the trees, the fountain trickled steadily, and the stars glimmered faintly above. Nothing hurried, nothing startled, nothing demanded attention. In this quietness, Queen Isolde felt the weight and the comfort of the world, enduring, unremarkable, and profoundly serene. And so night passed as it had always had, measured in the slow, deliberate movements of the kingdom, each heartbeat echoing the timeless rhythm of Valorith under the reign of its quiet, patient queen. The first light of dawn crept over the hills surrounding Valorith, pale and hesitant, as though unsure whether to disturb the kingdom's stillness. The sky was a soft gradient of lavender and pink, slowly shifting toward the warmer hues of morning. The wind moved faintly, brushing the leaves of the trees with a gentle touch, carrying the faint scent of dew-soaked grass and blooming herbs from the palace gardens. Inside the castle, Queen Isolde's chambers were bathed in the gentle glow of a few strategically placed lanterns. Their light reflected faintly off the polished stone floor, creating small pools of warmth amidst the deep shadows. She moved slowly across the room, her footsteps silent on the soft carpet. The silver crown rested nearby, untouched, its metal catching the flicker of the lantern flames in subdued glimmers. The castle itself was still, but not completely silent. Faint sounds drifted from distant corridors, the soft creak of a door swinging shut, the muted shuffle of a servant returning to quarters, and the occasional deliberate drip of water from the fountain outside. These were small, ordinary sounds, yet in the stillness of the night they seemed amplified, each one marking time as it passed. The queen walked to the balcony, wrapped in a shawl of pale silk. From this vantage, the kingdom appeared even more quiet. The streets below were deserted, the shops shuttered, and the occasional lantern flickered in the windows of homes where families had long since retired for the night. In the gardens, shadows lengthened under the pale light of the moon. A cat moved slowly among the hedges, stopping occasionally to sniff at a flower, then continuing its silent patrol. Even the wind moved cautiously, drifting through the leaves and brushing the stones of the courtyard with soft, measured strokes. It carried the scent of lavender and damp earth from the gardens, blending with the faint aroma of bread cooling in the baker's shop. The distant mountains were silhouetted against the starry sky, steady and unchanging, silent observers of the kingdom's nocturnal rhythms. Queen Isolde returned to her chamber, settling into her chair by the fire. The embers glowed faintly, casting soft, flickering shadows across the walls. She placed a small cup of water on the table and gazed into its still surface, observing the reflections of the lanterns and the slow movement of shadows. Her mind wandered quietly, noting the minutiae of the day, the way the roses bent slightly toward the sun, the manner in which the children traced patterns in the stones, the precise rhythm of the gardener's movements. Everything was small, deliberate, and unhurried, yet she observed it all with patient attention. Meanwhile, in the corridors of the castle, the night staff moved in slow, deliberate steps. They extinguished unnecessary lights, checked doors, and ensured that each room was in proper order. Their movements were careful, silent, and precise. Not a single task was rushed, nor did any sound disturb the overarching calm of the night. Even the servants' breaths seemed measured, synchronized with the natural rhythm of the castle. Outside, the kingdom rested. The fountain dripped in its quiet, steady cadence, and the occasional night bird called softly, its song almost swallowed by the immense stillness of the streets. The air was cool, carrying faint scents of herbs, flowers, and the lingering warmth of the day. Every element, from the smallest leaf to the tallest tower, moved at its own unhurried pace, preserving the tranquility of Valorith. As she closed her eyes, the rhythm of Valorith continued unabated. The distant mountains remained unmoved, the wind whispered softly through the trees, the fountain trickled steadily, and the stars glimmered faintly above. Nothing hurried, nothing startled, nothing demanded attention. In this quietness, Queen Isolde felt the weight and the comfort of the world, enduring, unremarkable, and profoundly serene. And so night passed as it had always had, measured in the slow, deliberate movements of the kingdom, each heartbeat echoing the timeless rhythm of Valorith under the reign of its quiet, patient queen. The first light of dawn crept over the hills surrounding Valorith, pale and hesitant, as though unsure whether to disturb the kingdom's stillness. The sky was a soft gradient of lavender and pink, slowly shifting toward the warmer hues of morning. The wind moved faintly, brushing the leaves of the trees with. By the time the sun had climbed high into the sky, the kingdom of Valorith had settled into a deliberate, measured rhythm. The air was warmer, carrying the faint scents of baking bread, fresh herbs, and the earth warmed by sunlight. Shadows cast by the tall castle walls stretched across the streets, moving so slowly that one could almost measure the passage of time by their gentle migration. Queen Isolde walked through the palace corridors after her morning routines, her steps deliberate, echoing softly against the stone floors. The silver crown rested on its velvet cushion nearby, catching the sunlight that filtered through the high windows. She did not wear it for these quiet hours. Instead, she preferred to observe the small movements of her household and the kingdom, seeing the world unfold at its unhurried pace. In the kitchens, the staff continued their careful preparations. A cook kneaded dough for the day's bread, pressing and folding it slowly, allowing it to rest at intervals that stretched for minutes, sometimes even longer. Another staff member stirred a pot of stew with long, deliberate strokes, ensuring each ingredient blended perfectly. The faint aroma drifted down the halls, reaching Queen Isolde as she passed by, a quiet reminder of the continuity of daily life. Outside in the courtyard, gardeners moved with patient precision. One trimmed a hedge, cutting each branch with careful attention, ensuring the shape remained perfectly symmetrical. Another watered the flower beds, droplets falling in slow, steady patterns onto the soil. Even the wind seemed to conform to the rhythm of the day, brushing gently through the leaves, carrying faint hints of lavender, rosemary, and the subtle earthy fragrance of freshly turned soil. The townspeople had begun their daily work, each task performed with slow deliberation. A baker arranged his loaves on shelves, ensuring every loaf was straight and evenly spaced. The blacksmith tapped lightly on a piece of iron, spacing each strike so the echo would fade before the next. A young child walked along the edge of the plaza, tracing the grooves in the stones with a finger, pausing to observe the faint lines of moss growing between them. Each action was patient, measured, and unhurried, a reflection of the kingdom's overarching pace. Queen Isolde paused in the balcony overlooking the town, watching the gentle rhythm of life. She noted how the sunlight shifted on the rooftops, how shadows lengthened imperceptibly, and how the leaves of the trees swayed slightly in the breeze. Even the smallest details seemed significant in their quiet constancy. A bird hopping from branch to branch, a cat stretching lazily on a warm stone wall, a lantern swinging gently in the soft wind. Inside the palace, advisors moved slowly through the corridors, carrying parchments and reports. Their voices were quiet, their discussions muted, and their steps deliberate. They consulted charts and maps that had changed little over the years, nodded to one another, and then returned to their offices. The halls were filled with a low hum of routine, the scrape of a broom, the distant clatter of dishes, the soft shuffle of feet along the stone floor. Each sound marked time, not with urgency but with careful measurement. By midday, the Queen returned to her study, where a window overlooked the gardens below. The sunlight fell gently across the pages of her chronicles, illuminating the careful script and the faded ink that recorded events from centuries past. She ran her finger along the lines, tracing the motions of previous rulers with a sense of calm patience. Everything she observed was slow, the light shifting across the pages, the soft flutter of leaves in the garden, the occasional movement of a gardener or a bird. Even the fountain in the central courtyard seemed to slow as the sun reached its zenith. Water dripped in a steady, unhurried rhythm, splashing softly into the basin below. Children occasionally paused near the fountain, observing the gentle ripples, tossing pebbles, and noting the way the water reflected sunlight. The Queen watched them with faint amusement, appreciating the quiet attention they paid to even the smallest, most ordinary details. The midday meal was prepared with the same care that marked every other task in Valerith. Platters were arranged neatly on the table, every piece of bread, cheese, and fruit carefully placed. The Queen ate slowly, noticing textures, tastes, and the warmth of each bite. Every moment was measured and deliberate, a reflection of the kingdom itself, calm, predictable, and serene. As the sun began its gradual descent towards the afternoon, the kingdom remained unchanged, its quiet rhythm undisturbed. Queen Isolde observed it all from her chambers, noting the steady passage of time in every small gesture, the rustle of leaves, the drip of water from the fountain, the careful movements of servants, gardeners, and townspeople. In Valerith, midday was not a time of rush or urgency. It was a time of steady continuity, a slow march of ordinary life that reflected the patient reign of its queen. And in this quiet, deliberate rhythm, there was a profound serenity, a comforting constancy that defined the kingdom and the world within which Queen Isolde lived. The sun leaned slowly toward the horizon, casting elongated shadows across the cobblestone streets of Valerith. Its light shifted from warm gold to a soft amber, touching every surface with gentle deliberation. The kingdom seemed to pause in acknowledgement of the day's slow transition, each stone, tree, and window catching the shifting glow without haste. Inside the castle, Queen Isolde moved through the corridors with measured steps. The silver crown rested nearby, catching flecks of sunlight that penetrated the tall windows. She did not wear it, preferring to let it remain on its cushion, a quiet reminder of the steady, unchanging nature of her reign. Her gown trailed softly behind her, brushing the polished stone floor with a gentle swish that echoed faintly in the high-ceilinged hallways. The palace staff had begun their late afternoon routines. A maid adjusted the arrangement of cushions in the sitting chambers, smoothing the fabric slowly and deliberately. Another prepared the table for the evening meal, arranging plates and utensils with meticulous care. In the kitchens, the cooks worked quietly, finishing the final touches on roasted vegetables and simmering stews, ensuring every dish was perfect, yet taking no urgency in their movements. Outside in the courtyard, the gardens were bathed in the mellow glow of late afternoon. Gardeners moved carefully among the plants, trimming hedges, adjusting flower beds, and attending to the herbs with meticulous attention. Each drop of water from the watering cans fell slowly, nourishing the soil and reflecting the waning sunlight. Birds perched lazily in the trees, occasionally preening or hopping from branch to branch, their wings fluttering without haste. The fountain dripped quietly, each droplet catching the last light of the sun before falling into the basin below. In the town beyond the castle walls, merchants began the slow process of closing their shops. Shutters were lowered with careful precision, signs hung straight, and the final coins of the day were counted with deliberate care. The blacksmith wiped down tools and stepped back to admire his work, spacing each motion evenly so that the rhythm of the day remained uninterrupted. Children wandered the streets one last time, tracing the lines of stone walls, observing the patterns in the cobblestones, and pausing to watch the sun's reflection in puddles left from the morning dew. Queen Isolde paused on a balcony overlooking the town. The streets below glowed softly under the sun's amber rays, lanterns were prepared but not yet lit, and shadows stretched across rooftops and walls. She observed the movement of people, the gentle sway of leaves in the gardens, and the slow rise and fall of the fountain water. Every detail held significance in its constancy, and she noted each with patient attention. The way a baker adjusted his bread tray, the measured sweep of a broom across the plaza, the cautious steps of a child following a line in the stones. The queen returned to her chambers and spent a quiet hour reviewing the records of her reign. Scrolls and ledgers, inked with the careful handwriting of scribes, recorded events both mundane and significant, though in Valorith even the significant events were small and measured. She ran her fingers lightly along the edges of the parchment, noting dates, minor transactions, and observations of past weather patterns. The movement of her hand was slow, almost ceremonial, as if she were physically tracing the steady pulse of her kingdom across the paper. As late afternoon turned toward early evening, the first hints of lantern light glimmered in the castle windows. Servants moved quietly to ensure all preparations were complete. The fire in the hearth was replenished, plates were polished, and the dining chamber arranged precisely. The scent of herbs, bread, and roasted vegetables drifted softly through the halls. Even the smallest movements, the soft shuffle of feet, the faint clink of utensils, the brushing of fabric, contributed to the gentle rhythm of the palace, as though every motion were synchronized with the slow pulse of the day. Queen Isolde paused by her window one final time before the evening fully arrived. The town lay bathed in a golden glow, shadows stretching across walls and streets, the fountain trickling its steady cadence, and the wind stirring the leaves in the gardens. She watched patiently, noting the perfection in the ordinary. A single flower bent slightly toward the sun, a bird hopped cautiously along the garden path, a child paused to observe the reflection of light in the fountain's water. Each moment was small, deliberate, and unhurried, yet the accumulation of these moments formed the serene continuity of her kingdom. In Valorith, late afternoon was a quiet transition, measured in light, movement, and breath. Nothing was rushed, nothing forced. Every stone, every leaf, every motion contributed to the same calm rhythm that defined the kingdom and the reign of Queen Isolde, patient, deliberate, and profoundly serene. The sun had almost fully disappeared behind the distant hills, leaving the kingdom of Valorith in a gentle twilight. The sky shifted through soft shades of amber, rose, and lavender before settling into the deep blue of early evening. Shadows lengthened and softened across the streets, stretching like slow, deliberate fingers over the cobblestones. The light lingered, hesitant to leave, as if the day itself wished to pause just a little longer before yielding to night. Inside the castle, Queen Isolde prepared for the evening with the same careful attention that marked every part of her day. She moved through the corridors slowly, her steps measured, her gown brushing softly against the polished stone floors. The silver crown rested on its cushion, catching the faint remaining sunlight, glimmering subtly, but she did not wear it. Its presence was a reminder, quiet yet ever-present, of the patient responsibility she carried. The castle staff were engaged in their evening routines. Maids adjusted cushions and drapery in the sitting chambers, smoothing fabric with meticulous care. In the kitchens, cooks completed the preparation of the evening meal. Roasted vegetables glimmered with a faint sheen of oil, bread was arranged precisely on wooden platters, and a light stew simmered slowly, releasing a faint, comforting aroma. Each movement, each gesture, was deliberate and unhurried, contributing to the calm rhythm of the castle. Outside in the courtyard, the gardens appeared almost golden in the last rays of sunlight. Gardeners trimmed hedges with careful precision, ensuring each plant retained its symmetry. Water from the fountain trickled steadily, catching the fading light in delicate, sparkling arcs. Birds settled into the branches of trees, their songs quieting to soft murmurs. Even the wind seemed to slow, brushing leaves and petals with gentle deliberation, as though respecting the kingdom's quiet evening rhythm. In the streets of Valorith, townspeople completed their final tasks for the day. A baker closed the shutters of his shop, carefully adjusting the panels until they were perfectly straight. The blacksmith wiped down his tools, inspecting each one with patient attention, ensuring no detail was overlooked. Children wandered slowly, lingering near the fountain or tracing the lines of the cobblestones with their fingers, absorbed in the quiet beauty of ordinary life. Queen Isolde sat in the dining chamber, the table arranged precisely with plates, utensils, and a few simple candles casting a soft, warm glow. She ate slowly, savoring each bite with deliberate care, noting textures, flavors, and the gentle warmth of the food. Outside the window, the last light of the day faded, and the shadows deepened. The fountain's soft trickle, the faint rustle of leaves, and the distant murmur of a lantern swaying in the wind became the quiet background to her evening. After the meal, the queen walked through the corridors of the castle. Servants moved quietly around her, ensuring everything was in order, their footsteps deliberate and soft. Draperies were straightened, furniture adjusted slightly, and every room prepared for the coming night. The castle was alive with gentle, unhurried activity, yet the calm and serenity of the day remained undisturbed. Queen Isolde paused on a balcony overlooking the town. The streets were quiet, lanterns glimmering faintly in windows, and the fountain reflected the soft light of the candles nearby. She observed the gentle rhythm of life, the slow movements of the townspeople finishing their tasks, the faint rustle of the gardens in the courtyard, and the steady pulse of the castle itself. Everything moved with measured precision, no detail overlooked, no action rushed. The evening passed slowly, measured in soft sounds, gentle movements, and quiet reflection. The queen returned to her chambers, setting the silver crown carefully back on its cushion. She observed it for a moment, noting its simplicity, its weight, and the way it seemed to capture the last light of the day. Then she sat by the window, watching the stars emerge one by one in the night sky, their faint glow mirrored by the lanterns and candles below. In Valorith, the evening was deliberate, calm, and unhurried. The kingdom existed in patient continuity. The stones, the plants, the people, the castle itself, all moved in quiet harmony. Queen Isolde felt the weight of this serene rhythm, understanding that her reign was not marked by excitement or sudden change, but by the slow, careful passage of time. And in that understanding, there was a profound sense of peace. The sky had deepened into a rich, velvety blue, dotted with faint stars that flickered slowly over the kingdom of Valorith. The last traces of sunset had vanished behind the distant hills, leaving only a soft, lingering glow near the horizon. The streets below were quiet, the shops closed, and the occasional flicker of a lantern the only indication of human presence. A gentle wind brushed through the trees, carrying the faint scent of herbs and the distant aroma of the evening meal lingering in the air. Inside the castle, Queen Isolde moved with calm deliberation through the halls. Her silver crown rested on its velvet cushion nearby, catching the faint flicker of candlelight and soft, muted glimmers. She did not wear it, choosing instead to observe her surroundings. Every step she took echoed softly against the polished stone floors, a reminder of the castle's quiet emptiness and the measured rhythm of life within its walls. The palace staff were engaged in their final routines for the day. Maids adjusted drapery, smoothing the folds with slow, precise motions. Servants checked that windows were closed, lanterns were trimmed and lit, and firewood was stacked neatly for the night. The kitchens, now mostly silent, still held the faint aroma of herbs and roasted vegetables, remnants of the evening meal, mixing with the soft warmth of the hearth. Outside in the courtyard, the gardens had assumed a deep, serene calm. The fountain's trickling water reflected the pale glow of the lanterns, each droplet catching the light as it fell with a gentle rhythm. Flowers and plants seemed to bend slightly under the night breeze, their movements slow and deliberate. A cat moved quietly among the hedges, pausing occasionally to watch a firefly hover before continuing its silent patrol. The shadows of trees stretched across the paths, moving almost imperceptibly as the wind rustled through the leaves. From her balcony, Queen Isolde observed the town. Streets were deserted, save for the occasional figure moving slowly along the edges of the plaza. A lantern glimmered in a distant window. The blacksmith had finished for the day, his tools resting neatly in their place. The baker had long since shuttered the shop, the warm aroma of bread lingering faintly in the air. Even the children, who had wandered so carefully during the day, had returned home, leaving only the faintest echoes of their footsteps behind. In her chambers, the queen prepared for the quiet conclusion of her day. She drew a small chair close to the hearth, allowing the soft embers to warm her hands. The silver crown sat on its cushion beside her, simple yet dignified, catching the firelight in subtle glimmers. She traced the smooth metal gently with her fingers, feeling its weight, its coldness, and the faint curve that rested so perfectly against a head. The crown, like her reign, was a symbol of patience, continuity, and quiet responsibility. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, filling the chamber with a gentle warmth and occasional sparks. Queen Isolde sipped water from a small cup, observing the reflection of the flame flicker across its surface. Outside, the wind whispered through the castle corridors, brushing softly against doors and windows. Every movement, every sound was deliberate, measured, and unhurried. Even in stillness there was a rhythm to Valerith, a quiet heartbeat that sustained the kingdom through each ordinary, unremarkable day. As the night deepened, the queen rose slowly and moved toward her bed. She adjusted the sheets, tucked them carefully around herself, and settled in with deliberate care. The silver crown remained on its cushion, the fire reduced to glowing embers, and the lanterns cast faint pools of light that did not disturb the serenity of the room. Outside, the fountain trickled, the trees swayed gently, and the stars shimmered faintly in the sky. Queen Isolde closed her eyes, absorbing the calm rhythm of the kingdom. Valerith was steady, unhurried, and patient. Every movement of people, animals, wind, and water contributed to the same quiet flow of life. Nothing rushed, nothing startled, nothing demanded attention. And in that deliberate stillness, the queen found peace, knowing that the slow, measured days of Valerith would continue, just as they always had. And so, late evening passed like all others, quiet, measured, and profoundly serene, a gentle echo of the reign of Queen Isolde, who ruled not with drama, but with patience, attention, and unwavering calm. Night had settled fully over Valerith. The sky was a deep, tranquil blue, dotted with pale stars that twinkled faintly, like tiny lanterns suspended in the vast darkness. The moon hung low, casting a gentle silver glow across the rooftops, gardens, and stone streets. Even the wind moved carefully, brushing leaves and petals with soft, measured strokes. The kingdom was silent, yet not lifeless, carrying a quiet pulse that echoed through the town, the castle, and the surrounding hills. Inside the castle, Queen Isolde moved slowly through the halls one final time. The silver crown rested on its velvet cushion, reflecting the pale moonlight in subdued glimmers. She paused at each window, observing the calm streets below. The lanterns glimmered faintly in the windows of houses, and the fountain in the courtyard shimmered under the moonlight, each droplet catching a moment of reflection before settling. The gardens were still, the leaves barely moving in the gentle breeze, as if the entire kingdom were holding its breath in reverence of the night. Servants moved quietly through the corridors, completing their final tasks. A maid adjusted a blanket in a guest chamber, smoothing the folds with slow precision. Another ensured that shutters were properly closed and that no candle flame burned too brightly. Every step, every gesture was deliberate, measured, and soft, contributing to the serene rhythm of the castle. Even the clink of utensils or the faint creak of the floor was absorbed into the gentle stillness. Queen Isolde returned to her private chambers, drawing a chair close to the hearth. The fire had been reduced to glowing embers, radiating a soft warmth across the stone floor. She sat quietly, observing the dance of the faint sparks and the subtle shadows they cast on the walls. Her mind wandered slowly, noting the minutiae of the day, the precise angles of the sun as it moved across the rooftops, the meticulous arrangement of herbs in the gardens, the soft cadence of the fountain, and the small movements of townspeople now asleep within their homes. The silver crown resting beside her was a reminder of the quiet duties that defined her reign. Not one of urgency or sudden change, but a steady, patient vigilance. She touched it lightly with her fingers, feeling the smooth curve and cold metal, appreciating the weight and the presence of something so simple, yet so symbolic. Its small gemstone glimmered faintly, catching the ember's reflection, a tiny reminder of continuity and calm. Outside, the town was cloaked in gentle stillness. Only the faint ripple of the fountain, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the distant sigh of the wind hinted at movement. Cats wandered quietly, pausing in the lantern glow before continuing on silent pause. The streets were empty, the shops shuttered, the marketplace deserted. Even the distant hills seemed still, their silhouettes dark against the star-speckled sky. Queen Isolde reflected on the day that had passed, the small, measured motions of the kingdom, and the enduring rhythm of life in Valerith. Every detail, no matter how ordinary, contributed to the kingdom's quiet pulse. Each gesture of the servants, each movement of the gardeners, each careful step of the townspeople, even the slow shift of shadows across the stone walls, maintained the harmony of the realm. There was beauty in this monotony, a profound serenity in the repetition, a comfort in the knowledge that the slow rhythm of life would continue tomorrow as it had today. Finally, the queen rose and prepared for bed. She adjusted her sheets with careful attention, ensuring they were smooth and comfortable. The fire was reduced to a few glowing embers, the lanterns dimmed, and the castle settled into absolute quiet. Queen Isolde lay down, pulling the blankets carefully around her. The silver crown remained on its cushion, the hearth's warmth slowly fading, the gentle whisper of the wind and the soft trickle of the fountain blending into a lullaby for the entire kingdom. And so the night passed, unhurried, deliberate, and profoundly serene, marking the continuous, quiet reign of Queen Isolde in Valerith, where every day and night flowed slowly, measured by patience, observation, and gentle care. Morning returned to Valerith without announcement. There was no sudden brightness, no dramatic change in the air. The night simply loosened its hold, allowing a thin, pale light to slip quietly across the eastern hills. The sky softened from deep blue into muted gray, then slowly into faint shades of ivory and rose. Time moved gently, almost reluctantly, as if the kingdom itself preferred not to hurry into a new day. Within the castle walls, Queen Isolde still slept. Her chamber was cool and silent, the air carrying the faint scent of stone, fabric, and the last warmth of the dying embers in the hearth. The silver crown rested where it always did, untouched on its velvet cushion. In the early light, it appeared less like a symbol of rule and more like an ordinary object, metal shaped by careful hands, waiting patiently, just as everything in Valorith waited. The castle awoke gradually. A distant door opened and closed with a soft echo. Somewhere in the corridors, footsteps passed slowly, never hurried. A servant paused to adjust a curtain, allowing just enough light to enter a hallway. The stone floors, cool and smooth, reflected the faint glow of dawn in pale, uneven patches. Nothing disturbed the stillness. Each sound seemed to apologize for existing. Outside, the gardens responded to the morning with quiet acceptance. Dew rested on leaves and petals, unmoving, reflecting the pale sky above. The fountain continued its steady trickle, unchanged by night or day, each drop falling at the same patient pace as it always had. Birds appeared one by one, perching silently before offering soft, tentative calls that blended into the air rather than breaking it. Queen Isolde woke slowly. She did not rise at once. Instead, she lay still, listening, not for anything in particular, but for the familiar absence of urgency. The faint sounds of the castle morning reached her. Distant movement, a quiet breath of wind through the window, the steady continuation of life. She sat up gradually, placing her feet on the floor and allowing the cool stone to remind her of the day's beginning. She dressed with deliberate care. Each movement was unhurried. The fabric of her gown fell into place without resistance, the familiar weight resting comfortably on her shoulders. She glanced briefly at the crown, acknowledging it without touching it. There was no need to rush toward it. It would remain as it always did. Stepping toward the window, Queen Isolde looked out over Valorith as the town slowly emerged from sleep. Shutters opened one by one. Smoke began to rise gently from a few chimneys, drifting lazily into the morning air. The streets remained mostly empty, though a baker could be seen arranging bread inside his shop with careful precision. A cleaner swept the plaza slowly, pausing often, as if time itself were something to be handled gently. The light strengthened, though it never became harsh. It settled softly on rooftops, walls, and stone paths, revealing the familiar textures of the kingdom. Nothing had changed from the day before. The same stones lay in the same places, the same trees stood in quiet patience. Even the shadows seemed to remember where they belonged. Queen Isolde walked through the corridors, her steps steady and soft. Servants greeted her with small nods, their movements careful and respectful, not out of fear, but habit. In the kitchen, breakfast was prepared slowly, bread sliced evenly, bowls placed carefully, water poured without spilling. The aroma was gentle, never overwhelming. She ate in silence, noticing each small detail, the warmth of the bread, the stillness of the room, the way the morning light moved gradually across the table. Outside, the fountain continued, the birds shifted positions, and the day advanced without instruction. After breakfast, Queen Isolde walked into the inner gardens. The dew had begun to fade, though some droplets clung stubbornly to shaded leaves. Gardeners worked quietly, trimming, watering, and adjusting plants with patience that matched the pace of the kingdom. No one spoke loudly. No one hurried. Even the tools moved slowly, as if respecting the rhythm of Valorith. She paused near a stone bench and sat for a while, watching nothing in particular. A leaf fell gently from a tree and came to rest on the path. A bird hopped twice, then stopped. The air warmed slightly. Time passed. In Valorith, morning was not a beginning, it was a continuation. The night had ended, but nothing had truly changed. Life moved forward in the same measured way it always had, guided not by urgency, but by repetition and calm observation. Queen Isolde remained still, content in the knowledge that the kingdom required no great action from her at that moment. It only required presence, patience, and attention to the ordinary. And so the day unfolded once more, quietly and predictably, under the steady reign of a queen who understood the value of slowness. Late morning arrived in Valorith without any clear boundary. The early light did not suddenly become brighter, nor did the air shift dramatically. Instead, the morning simply deepened. The sun rose a little higher, and the pale warmth it carried spread gently across stone walls, rooftops, and garden paths. Time advanced quietly, without insisting that anyone notice. Queen Isolde remained in the inner gardens for a long while. She did not measure the time by clocks or bells. She noticed it instead by the way shadows shortened beneath the trees and by the subtle change in temperature as the air grew slightly warmer. The stone bench beneath her felt less cool than it had earlier, absorbing the sunlight slowly, as all things in Valorith absorbed change, patiently and without resistance. The gardeners continued their work in near silence. One carefully loosened soil around the base of a rosebush, stopping often to inspect the roots before continuing. Another wiped moisture from broad leaves with a cloth, moving leaf by leaf, never rushing. Water from a metal can poured in thin, controlled streams, darkening the earth gradually. No drop was wasted, and no movement was unnecessary. From beyond the garden walls, the faint sounds of the town drifted in. They were not loud enough to distract, only present enough to remind the queen that Valorith was awake. Footsteps echoed briefly along stone streets before fading. A merchant spoke softly to a customer. A door closed, then remained closed. The fountain, as always, continued its steady rhythm, unchanged by the hour. Queen Isolde rose and walked slowly along the garden path. She paused often, not because she needed rest, but because there was no reason to move quickly. She examined the texture of the stone beneath her feet, worn smooth by countless steps over generations. She noticed how moss grew only in certain cracks, favoring shade and moisture. Even these small details held consistency, a quiet order that required no correction. Inside the castle, late morning followed the same unhurried pattern. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, shifting gradually across the floors and walls. Servants moved through corridors carrying linens, trays, and records. Each step was measured. Each task was performed fully, without anticipation of the next. A scribe sharpened a quill carefully, testing its points before writing a single word. Ink was stirred gently, then left to settle. Queen Isolde entered the long hall where records of the kingdom were kept. Shelves lined the walls holding scrolls and ledgers bound in fading leather. She walked along them slowly, her fingers brushing the spines without selecting any particular one. These records were not urgent. They existed to be preserved, not hurried through. The past of Valorith was stable, just like its present. She eventually sat at a wooden table near the window. Light fell across the surface, illuminating dust particles drifting lazily in the air. She opened a ledger and read a few lines, notes about crop yields, weather patterns, and repairs to the eastern wall. Nothing unexpected, nothing alarming. The kingdom continued to exist as it always had, supported by small, repeated actions. Outside, the town settled into its late morning pace. The baker arranged fresh loaves in neat rows. The blacksmith worked slowly, spacing each strike so that the sound faded completely before the next began. Children walked together without urgency, stopping often to observe insects near the edge of the plaza or to trace shapes in the stone with their shoes. Queen Isolde closed the ledger and rested her hands on the table. She looked out the window again, watching the sunlight creep further along the walls of the courtyard. The fountains shimmered slightly more brightly now, reflecting the stronger light. The birds had grown quieter, resting in shaded branches. Even the wind seemed to pause, allowing the warmth to settle undisturbed. Late morning in Valorith was not a transition towards something greater, it was simply another steady moment in a continuous sequence. Nothing pushed forward, nothing pulled back. Life remained balanced in its own quiet repetition. Queen Isolde stood, smoothing the fabric of her gown, and left the hall without haste. The day would continue, just as the days before it had. The hours would pass gently, measured not by events, but by light, shadow, and the slow movement of ordinary life. And so, Valorith endured, unchanged, calm, and unremarkable under the watchful presence of a queen who understood that stability itself was the greatest form of rule. Midday approached Valorith without announcement. There was no bell to mark it, no sudden pause in movement. The sun simply reached a higher point in the sky, and the light became steadier, more direct, yet still gentle. Shadows shortened beneath walls and trees, settling close to the objects that created them. The warmth spread evenly across the kingdom, touching stone, soil, and skin with the same quiet patience. Queen Isolde walked slowly through the outer corridor that overlooked the courtyard. The stone beneath her feet had warmed slightly since morning, and she noticed the difference immediately. It was not dramatic, but it was there, a subtle reminder that time was passing, even if nothing else appeared to change. She paused near a column and rested her hand against it, feeling the smooth surface that had been shaped long before her reign. Below, the courtyard remained calm. The fountain continued its gentle flow, unchanged in rhythm or sound. Sunlight reflected off the water, creating faint, shifting patterns on the surrounding stone. A gardener adjusted the position of a small plant to ensure it received equal light, then stepped back to observe the result for several moments before moving on. Every action was deliberate, measured, and quiet. Inside the castle, midday routines unfolded slowly. Servants carried water jugs through the halls, careful not to spill a single drop. Windows were opened slightly to allow air to move through, then adjusted again when the breeze grew a little stronger than desired. In the kitchens, the midday meal was prepared without urgency. Ingredients were washed, cut, and arranged with precision. Pots rested over low flames, stirred occasionally, never rushed. Queen Isolde entered the dining chamber well before the meal was ready. She preferred to arrive early, to sit and observe the room as it existed in stillness. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the table and revealing faint scratches in the wood left by generations of use. Dust particles floated slowly through the air, visible only when they passed through the light. When the meal was served, it was simple and orderly. Bread, vegetables, and water were placed carefully before her. She ate slowly, noticing the texture of each bite, the temperature of the food, and the quiet around her. There was no conversation, no interruption. The only sounds were those of careful movement from the servants and the distant, steady presence of the fountain outside. Beyond the castle walls, the town of Valorith followed its midday rhythm. Shops remained open, though customers moved slowly, browsing without urgency. A cart rolled across the square at an even pace, its wheels producing a soft, repetitive sound against the stone. Children sat in the shade, watching insects move through the grass or tracing shapes in the dirt with sticks. Queen Isolde returned to the balcony after her meal. She stood quietly, looking out over the rooftops and streets. The sunlight rested evenly across the town now, revealing every familiar detail. Nothing demanded her attention, nothing required immediate decision. The kingdom functioned smoothly on routine alone, guided by habit and consistency. She remained there for some time, hands folded, posture relaxed. A breeze passed gently, lifting the edge of her sleeve before settling again. The trees swayed slightly, then became still. Somewhere in the distance, a hammer struck metal once, then did not strike again for several long moments. Midday in Valorith was not a peak. It was not a turning point. It was simply another moment in an unbroken sequence of calm hours. The sun would eventually move on, shadows would lengthen again, evening would arrive as quietly as morning had. Queen Isolde turned away from the balcony and walked back into the castle, her steps slow and even. The silver crown remained where it always was, waiting without demand. The kingdom continued without pause. And so, midday passed, steady, uneventful, and serene. Another ordinary chapter in the quiet life of Valorith, ruled by a queen who valued patience above all else. Early afternoon settled over Valerith so gently that most people did not notice when it began. The sun had moved only slightly from its midday position, and yet the light felt different, softer at the edges, warmer against stone and skin. Shadows lengthened just enough to be observed by those who paid attention, though nothing in the kingdom required attention at that moment. Queen Isolde walked through a shaded corridor that overlooked the outer gardens. The air inside the castle was cool, balanced carefully by thick stone walls that resisted sudden change. She appreciated this steadiness. Her footsteps echoed faintly, then faded, leaving silence behind. Each sound existed briefly and then gave way again to calm. In the gardens, early afternoon brought little change. The gardeners continued their work at the same unhurried pace. One paused to straighten a line of stones along a path, adjusting each piece slightly before moving on. Another sat briefly on a low wall, wiping their hands and observing the plants in silence before standing again. Water soaked into the soil slowly, darkening it in irregular patterns that remained unchanged for long minutes. The fountain shimmered under the afternoon light, its movement steady and predictable. Queen Isolde stopped near it, listening to the water fall. It was not loud enough to distract, only present enough to remind her that time was moving forward, even when everything felt still. She watched the ripples spread and fade, repeating again and again without variation. Inside the castle, early afternoon was a time of maintenance rather than action. Servants checked doors, adjusted tapestries, and folded linens. Each task was performed with care, but without urgency. A broom swept the floor in long, even strokes. A window was opened slightly, then closed again when the breeze shifted. The rhythm of work remained constant. Queen Isolde entered the record chamber once more, not because there was new information to review, but because the room itself brought a sense of order. She sat at a desk and rearranged a small stack of scrolls, aligning their edges carefully. She did not open them. The act of arranging them was enough. Outside the castle walls, Valerith moved at its early afternoon pace. Shops remained open, though fewer customers passed through. The marketplace was quieter now, the energy of midday softened into stillness. A merchant leaned against a stall, watching the square without expression. A cart stood motionless, its owner seated nearby, waiting without impatience. Children had grown quieter as well. Some rested in shaded corners, others walked slowly along the edges of the plaza, their earlier excitement replaced by calm curiosity. A group sat near the fountain, tossing small stones into the water and watching the ripples fade. They repeated the motion without speaking, content in the repetition. Queen Isolde returned to her chambers. The silver crown remained untouched, its surface catching the afternoon light in faint reflections. She paused briefly, acknowledging it with a glance, then turned away. There was no need for ceremony in these hours. Early afternoon belonged to continuity, not decision. She sat near the window, watching the light move across the floor. Minute by minute, the brightness shifted, revealing and then concealing small details in the stone. Dust drifted lazily in the air. Somewhere below, a door closed. The sound traveled upward, then disappeared. Early afternoon in Valerith carried no message and no urgency. It was a stretch of time meant to be passed gently, without resistance. The kingdom did not ask for more than presence and patience. Queen Isolde remained still, breathing evenly, her thoughts unoccupied by concern. The day continued exactly as it had been doing since sunrise, slow, steady, and quietly unremarkable. And so, early afternoon passed, adding another calm layer to the endless, measured life of Valerith and the peaceful reign of its queen. Late afternoon returned to Valerith almost unnoticed. The sun shifted gradually toward the western sky, though its warmth remained steady and calm. The light softened slightly, losing the firmness of midday and becoming more forgiving as it settled against the stone walls, paths, and rooftops. Shadows grew longer, stretching carefully across the ground as if they were in no hurry to reach their full length. Queen Isolde walked along the inner corridor where tall windows faced the gardens. The light filtered through the glass in pale bands, falling across the floor in quiet patterns that changed so slowly they could only be noticed after several minutes. She paused often, observing how these shapes moved, then resumed her slow pace without urgency. In the gardens, late afternoon brought subtle change rather than action. Leaves shifted gently in the breeze, and the flowers leaned slightly, adjusting to the angle of the sun. Gardeners completed their tasks one by one, not because time demanded it, but because the work was naturally coming to its end. Tools were cleaned carefully and placed back in their proper locations. Watering cans were set down and hands were wiped slowly on cloths before being folded at rest. The fountain continued its steady movement, reflecting the softened light in quiet flashes. Queen Isolde stood beside it for a while, listening. The sound of water was familiar, unchanged, a constant presence through every hour of the day. She found comfort in its predictability, in the way it marked time without insisting upon it. Inside the castle, servants moved into late afternoon routines. Floors were swept once more, curtains adjusted to soften the incoming light, and doors checked without noise. In the kitchens, preparations for the evening meal began slowly. Ingredients were laid out neatly and flames were kept low. Nothing was hurried. The pace remained steady, even gentle. Queen Isolde entered the sitting chamber and rested briefly in a chair near the window. She did not read or write. She simply watched the light fade from bright gold into softer amber. The room seemed to grow quieter as the afternoon progressed, though it had never truly been loud. Beyond the castle walls, Valerith followed the same calm transition. Merchants began to organize their goods, not yet closing, but preparing. Shoppers moved more slowly now, lingering less. The marketplace softened into stillness, its energy gradually dissolving. A bell rang once in the distance, then did not ring again. Children drifted homeward without direction, stopping often, walking slowly. Some sat on low steps, watching the shadows grow. Others traced familiar paths, following them without thought. The streets remained peaceful, unchanged by the hour. Queen Isolde rose from her chair and returned to her chambers. The silver crown rested quietly where it always had, catching the final brightness of the afternoon. She adjusted a fold of fabric nearby, then stepped away again. Late afternoon did not require symbols or decisions. The light outside dimmed further, and the first hints of evening began to appear. The air cooled slightly. A breeze passed through the gardens and faded. Everything settled gently into its place. Late afternoon in Valerith did not end, it softened, blending seamlessly into what came next. And through it all, the kingdom remained unchanged, steady in its calm rhythm, watched over by a queen who understood that time itself did not need to be guided, only allowed to pass. Early evening arrived in Valerith the way all things arrived in the kingdom, without insistence. The sun lowered itself gradually toward the horizon, and the light softened further, losing its warmth and turning gentle and mild. The air cooled slightly, enough to be noticed only by those who stood still long enough to feel the change. Queen Isolde stood near one of the tall windows in the western wing of the castle. From there, she could see the sun resting just above the distant hills, its glow spreading evenly across rooftops and stone walls. She did not move for some time. There was no reason to. Early evening required observation, not action. Inside the castle, the shift toward evening was subtle. Lanterns were prepared, but not yet lit. Curtains were adjusted carefully, allowing the last daylight to enter without glare. Servants moved quietly, speaking only when necessary, and even then in low tones. Footsteps echoed softly and then disappeared, leaving the halls calm once more. In the gardens, early evening brought a noticeable stillness. The gardeners had finished their work and now walked slowly away, carrying tools that no longer made sound. Leaves stirred gently, responding to a faint breeze that passed and then faded. Flowers closed slightly, not fully, but enough to signal the coming night. The fountain continued its steady flow, unchanged and unbothered by the hour. Queen Isolde walked through the courtyard at an unhurried pace. The stone beneath her feet had cooled since late afternoon. She noticed this immediately, appreciating the consistency with which the kingdom responded to the sun's movement. Each step was even, each breath was calm. Beyond the castle walls, Valerith transitioned gently into evening. Shops began to close, not all at once, but one by one. Shutters were lowered carefully, doors closed without noise. Merchants counted their goods slowly, arranging them neatly before leaving. The marketplace grew quieter, its activity dissolving into stillness without resistance. Children returned home gradually. Some lingered in the streets, watching the changing sky. Others sat on doorsteps, swinging their legs idly. No one rushed them. Evening allowed time to stretch. Queen Isolde returned to the interior of the castle as the light faded further. In the dining chamber, the evening meal was being arranged. Plates were placed evenly, candles were set, but not yet lit. The room existed in anticipation, though nothing was expected. She sat briefly at the table, resting her hands calmly in her lap. She did not feel hunger yet. Instead, she listened to the distant fountain, to the soft movement of fabric in the halls, to the quiet breath of the castle itself. Everything existed in balance. The silver crown remained in her chambers, untouched. Evening did not demand ceremony. It did not require authority. It required only patience. Outside, the sky shifted into deeper shades of amber and pale violet. Shadows stretched across the town, merging gently with one another. The wind moved once more, brushing the trees and then retreating again. Early evening in Valorith was not an ending, it was a pause, a long, gentle pause between daylight and night. The kingdom rested within it comfortably, neither waking nor sleeping, simply existing. Queen Isolde stood and walked slowly toward her chambers, her movements unhurried. The day was continuing exactly as it should, without interruption, without drama, without change. And so early evening settled fully into place, calm and steady, another quiet layer added to the endlessly patient life of Valorith and the reign of its quietly observant queen. Evening in Valorith slowly deepened, almost without anyone noticing the exact moment it changed. The sky darkened in soft layers, one shade blending into the next. What had once been pale amber faded into muted blues, and then into a calm, even dusk. The transition was so gentle that it felt less like a change and more like a continuation. Queen Isolde remained within the castle, moving quietly through familiar corridors. Lamps were lit one by one, their flames small and steady. Each light added warmth to the stone halls, without disturbing the silence. The glow reflected faintly on polished surfaces, creating soft highlights that remained still. In the dining chamber, the evening meal began and ended without significance. Plates were filled modestly, movements were slow. Conversation, if any existed, stayed low and brief. Queen Isolde ate without distraction, pausing often between bites. There was no schedule to follow and no event to prepare for. Outside, Valorith grew quieter. The last shops closed their doors and the streets emptied naturally. Footsteps became rare. The marketplace stood still, its stalls dark and orderly. The town did not sleep suddenly, it simply settled. In the gardens, night began to assert itself. The air cooled further, and moisture gathered lightly on leaves and stone. The fountain continued its flow, unchanged and steady, its sound now more noticeable in the quiet. Shadows thickened beneath trees, remaining motionless. Queen Isolde walked briefly along the balcony, wrapped lightly against the cooling air. She looked out over the town, where small points of lantern light appeared in windows. Each light existed alone, yet together they formed a calm pattern across the landscape. She watched without thought, letting the moment remain exactly as it was. Within the castle, doors were closed softly, curtains were drawn, servants completed their final tasks and withdrew without announcement. The halls grew still, holding the day's quiet within their walls. The silver crown rested where it always did, catching a faint reflection from a nearby lamp. Queen Isolde passed by it without stopping. Night did not require symbols, it required rest. The sky above Valerith darkened fully now, stars appearing slowly, one by one. There was no sudden brilliance, only gradual presence. The moon rose calmly, pale and distant, offering a steady light that asked for nothing. Queen Isolde returned to her chambers and sat near the window for a while longer. She listened to the faint sounds of the night, the fountain, the wind brushing stone, the distant stillness of the town. Time felt wide and unmeasured. Evening had fully become night, but nothing had truly changed. Valerith remained calm, steady, and untroubled. The day ended without ceremony, just as it had begun. And so the night settled gently over the kingdom, carrying with it the same quiet rhythm that had always defined the reign of Queen Isolde. Late night arrived in Valerith slowly, without announcement. The sky had fully darkened, and the stars remained steady in their places, unmoving and patient. The moon hung calmly above the town, casting a soft, even light across rooftops, paths, and the quiet stone walls of the castle. Queen Isolde remained awake a while longer, though there was no reason to do so. In her chambers, a single lamp burned with a small, steady flame. Its light reached only a short distance, leaving the corners of the room undisturbed. The curtains were drawn halfway, allowing moonlight to rest lightly on the floor. She sat in a chair near the window, hands folded, breathing slow and even. There were no thoughts demanding attention. Late night did not invite reflection or worry. It simply existed, offering stillness in its purest form. Throughout the castle, most rooms were dark now. Doors were closed, corridors stood empty. The stone walls held the day's remaining warmth, releasing it gradually into the night air. Occasionally, a soft sound echoed, a distant footstep, the gentle settling of wood, but these sounds passed quickly and did not return. In the gardens, late night brought deep quiet. The breeze had faded completely. Leaves rested without movement. The fountain continued its endless flow, now the clearest found in the open space. Water caught moonlight briefly, before disappearing again into shadow. Beyond the castle, Valerith slept. Homes were dark, with only a few lamps still glowing faintly. Streets were empty, no carts passed, no voices carried through the air. The town rested in a way that felt complete and unbroken. Queen Isolde rose slowly and walked once more through her chambers. She adjusted nothing, changed nothing, and left everything as it was. The silver crown remained untouched, reflecting a faint glow that shifted slightly as she passed. She returned to the window for one final look at the night. The moonlight did not demand attention, it simply remained. The stars stayed where they were. Time moved forward quietly, without counting itself. At last, Queen Isolde prepared to rest. The lamp was dimmed, the room grew darker, holding only the soft light from the moon. She lay down calmly, without urgency, allowing the quiet of late night to settle around her. Valerith remained unchanged as the hours passed. Late night did not bring dreams or disturbances. It brought rest, silence, and continuation. And so late night held the kingdom gently, preserving its stillness, until morning would arrive just as quietly, without hurry and without purpose. The final hours of night unfolded in Valorith without distinction. Time passed quietly, measured only by the steady movement of the moon as it shifted slightly across the sky. Darkness remained soft rather than heavy, resting gently over the town and the surrounding fields. Within the castle, everything stayed still. Corridors remained empty and doors stayed closed. The stone walls absorbed the quiet, holding it carefully as if preserving it. No lamps burned now. Only moonlight traced faint shapes across the floors and walls, changing slowly as the night progressed. Queen Isolde slept peacefully in her chambers. Her rest was unbroken and without dreams worth noting. The slow rhythm of her breathing matched the calm of the kingdom itself. There were no disturbances to pull her from sleep, no sounds demanding attention. In the gardens, moisture settled gently on leaves and stone. The fountain continued its endless flow, its sound soft and consistent, never rising or falling. Shadows remained deep beneath the trees, unmoving. The air felt cool and steady. Beyond the castle walls, Valorith rested in complete silence. Streets remained empty, windows were dark. The marketplace stood untouched, waiting without awareness for the return of daylight. Even the distant countryside seemed still, as if the land itself were asleep. The moon lowered gradually, its light becoming less direct. Stars remained visible, though some faded slightly as the sky began its slow transition. There was no clear moment when night began to loosen its hold. It simply softened, minute by minute. Inside the castle, a faint shift in air moved through the halls, unnoticed and unimportant. Time continued forward without announcing itself. Everything remained in place. As the final hours of night passed, the sky hinted gently at change. Darkness thinned just enough to suggest what would come next, though nothing had yet arrived. Valorith remained wrapped in quiet, unchanged and undisturbed. Queen Isolde continued to sleep as the night prepared to release the world back to light. There was no urgency in this transition. Morning would come when it came. And so the final hours of night completed their slow journey, leaving Valorith exactly as it had been, calm, patient, and steady, ready to continue its quiet existence without expectation or excitement.